Hi, and welcome back to Sociology 1. Today we're going to look at research and how is it done. So much of our knowledge is based on tradition, handing down of statements, beliefs, and customs, and generation to generation. Another source of knowledge is authority, a socially accepted source of information that includes experts, parents, government officials, police, judges, and religious leaders. Knowledge based on tradition and authority simplify our lives because it provides us with the basic rules about socially and legally accepted behavior. The information can be misleading or wrong, however. Suppose a 2-year-old throws a temper tantrum at the family barbecue. One adult comments, "What that kid needs is a good smack on the behind." Someone else might immediately disagree. "All kids go through this stage, just ignore it." Who's right? To answer this and other questions, sociologists rely on research methods, organized and systematic procedures to gain knowledge about a particular topic. Much research shows, for example, that neither ignoring nor inflicting physical punishment like spanking stops a toddler's bad behavior. Instead, most young children's misbehavior can be curbed by having some simple rules and being consistent in disciplining misbehavior, and, more importantly, praising good behavior and setting a good example. Now, in contrast to tradition and authority, sociological research is important in our everyday life for several reasons, including counteracting misinformation, which of course is very common right now with the amount of misinformation that circulates through social media. It exposes myths, or how to break myths. It helps explain why people behave the way they do. Also, much of the research in sociology helps explain why people behave the way they do and impacts social policy. And as well, it sharpens our critical thinking skills, and that's really important. So let's find out more about sociological research. Now, as mentioned in the introduction, there are many ways of knowing. You can know through personal experience, through tradition, through authority, religion, and science. However, science has some fundamental ways to address differences and gain understanding. That personal experience, authority, tradition, or religion have difficulty doing. So let's review this. Science is empirical. Now, and that basically is looking at the knowledge is best gained by direct, systematic observation. Now, we won't go into a lot of detail of what that all means, but to suggest that every bit of research is done directly through observation and a systematic means of doing that, so nobody can have their bias put into it. Secondly, scientific knowledge is systematic and public. If it's not made public and it's not verified, it's not accepted research. And 3, science has a built-in mechanism for self-correction by creating hypotheses and then testing them. Hypotheses are tentative statements of the relationship between two or more concepts or variables. The 4th point is science is objective, to ensure that the scientists' bias and their values do not affect their research. Now, empirical studies fall into one of two categories. There's either descriptive studies, an attempt to describe social reality, or provide some fact about some group or practice or event. An explanatory studies attempt to explain the relationship and to provide information on why certain events do or do not occur. In either category, descriptive or explanatory, theory and research form a continuous cycle which encompasses both a deductive approach, which that just basically means beginning with a theory and then testing it, and an inductive approach, which in this case means beginning with data whose analysis then generates a theory. So the process of sociological research, there's two, but we're going to start with quantitative. Now, quantitative is an objectively studying of data that can be measured numerically, and that's your research. And the data that's collected is measured numerically is because you can see it and therefore you can count it. The data is just basically how many of a certain age, race, sex, education, income, and you control for bias. The qualitative, now quantitative was the first one, qualitative is the second one. And these are interpretive descriptions. You're creating words that describe things, a discovery of underlying meaning, patterns of social relationships, interpretive descriptions. Again, about using words from interviews, observations, surveys, and questionnaires. Now, we're going to begin more with the quantitative, the numerical one. Quantitative research model. The first thing that you do is you select and define the research problem. Now, for many researchers, they basically already have some sense. They come from either their own personal experience where something just really confused them and they really wanted to sort it out, or they have other social issues that they're aware of that they'd like to approach. So you would essentially consider your personal experience or social issues. You'd ask a lot of questions. So secondly, you review to see if there was any previous research. What's been done before? Assist in the narrowing down of a topic. One of the major problems with hypotheses or coming up with a topic is it's too broad. We need to narrow it down. Thirdly, you formulate a hypothesis. Now, as mentioned earlier, a hypotheses are tentative statements that show the relationship between two or more concepts or variables. So let's figure out what a variable is. A variable is any concept with measurable traits or characteristics that vary from person to person, or from time to time, or situation to situation, or society to society. So all of these features would be variables. Then there's the independent variable and a dependent variable. So the independent variable is a variable that is presumed to cause or determine the independent variable. So the independent variable impacts the dependent variable, and it's the dependent variable we observe and record what the impact is. So the dependent variable is a variable that is assumed to be dependent on or be caused by the independent variable. Now, I'll give an example in a minute. Now, in order to begin the research, we have to make sure that we keep our opinion or opinionated words out. So we have to do what's called an operational definition. This is where we are taking the abstract and putting it into terms that can be observed and counted. And I've worked as a behavior consultant for many years, and doing descriptive recording of observations becomes second nature, but it's not as easy to do if you're not used to doing it. Now, fourth, you develop the research design. Now, whether you're choosing to do an experiment, a survey research, or field research, or even secondary analysis of data, the researcher must evaluate the strength and the weakness of each. Fifth, collect and analyze the data. Now, there's two terms that we need to be aware of when it relates to data. One is validity, the extent to which a study or research instrument accurately measures what it's supposed to measure. Now, I've got some weigh scales behind me there. Weigh scales measure weight. not intelligence or creativity or communication skills. So if your weigh scale measures weight, it's valid. Reliability, well, that's the extent to which a study or research instrument yields consistent results. Back to the weigh scales. You measure your weight accurately every time you measure. So if I measure myself every minute for 5 minutes, I should expect the same weight every minute if I don't put anything in my body and I don't let anything out. So that would make it reliable as a weigh scale. All research methods must be valid and reliable to be effective. And then 6, the researchers draw conclusions and report the findings. After analyzing the data, researchers first draw conclusions that relate the data to the hypothesis. Then they report the findings, which allows for other researchers to replicate the research. And that's important. Replication is the repetition of the investigation in substantially the same way, and to ensure and to be informed as to whether you get the exact same results or different results by doing the experiment in exactly the same way as the first person. So you're replicating it. And this is just a way to verify and check results. Now, the qualitative research model, although it's the same underlying logic as is involved in both quantitative and qualitative, sociological research, the styles of the two models are very different. Qualitative research is more likely to be used where the research question does not easily lend itself to numbers or in a statistical method. So, 1, the researcher begins with a general rather than a detailed plan. The researcher has to decide when the literature review and theory application should take place. Then 3, the study yields a detailed view of the topic. There might be fewer cases, possibly even one in the way of a case study, and there may be many variables. So let's look at that research method then. So how do sociologists decide which research method to use? Well, how and why are some approaches better than other approaches? Research methods are specific strategies or techniques for conducting research, and we're going to review some of the methods. Please review the strengths and weaknesses of each, as that is what helps decide which they need for their topics of focus. So let's look at the types of research methods, and we're going to begin with the first one, which is experiments. An experiment is a carefully designed situation in which the researcher studies the impact of certain variables on the subject's attitude or behavior. So you have to come up with 2 groups. You need an experimental group and you need a control group. The experimental group contains subjects who are exposed to the independent variable. Now remember, the independent variable is that variable that will impact or have an effect on the dependent variable. The control group contains the subjects who are not exposed to the independent variable. The simplest experimental design. 1, all subjects are pre-tested. That's measured in terms of the dependent variable. 2, subjects in the experimental group are then exposed to the stimuli. That's the independent variable. And then 3, all subjects are post-tested. They're remeasured in terms of the dependent variable. Now, if on page, I think it's 36, you'll see an example. Would you help another person is the name of that example. Other examples are including famous researchers Milgram and Ausch, who did experiments on conformity and on obedience, and Zimbardo's prison experiment are examples of experiments. Now, the second type of research method is called surveys. Survey research is the method perhaps most often associated with sociology. It's a research method in which a number of respondents are asked identical questions through a systematic questionnaire or interview. Now, the respondents are people who provide data for the analysis through their interviews and questionnaires. Now, survey research involves some type of sampling. So when we talk about sampling, there would still be a population. Now, a population in a research study are those people who are wanted to be included and draw conclusions. So a sample is another part of that population. You have a population, that's that group of people you want to target and want to get research on, so you have to get a sample of that group. The sample are people who are selected from the population to be studied. Now, what's important about that sample is it should be, in fact it's imperative, that it is a representative sample. A sample that has essentially the same characteristics as the total population. So if our total population is divided down the middle as being 50% men and 50% women, our sample also needs to be of the same percentage. And it needs to be random sample. That is, that persons are selected by chance or randomly. Thirdly, there we go. Field research. Now, field research is the study of social life in its natural setting, observing and interviewing people where they live, work, and play. A fuller understanding can be developed through observations and face-to-face discussions and the participation in events. But there are two approaches to observation. Complete observation. Here the research systematically observes social processes but does not take part in it. Usually they're off to the side or out of view. And then there's the participant observation. Researchers collect information while participating in the life of the people. It's also referred to as ethnography. Now, the observational research can take place just about anywhere. When I was a consultant, I did observations both in rooms with a two-way mirror where I couldn't be seen and where I was participated, say, in a daycare and I was seen. I've done both of those observations, and they're very, very different. Now, in addition, there are unstructured and there are structured interviews. Unstructured interview is an extended, open-ended interaction between an interviewer and an interviewee. Now, open-ended means asking questions that don't require a single word response, like yes and no. That asks somebody to give more information because it's open-ended. It enables interviewers to learn more about the interviewee's life and thoughts. Now, I mentioned earlier around secondary analysis of existing data, and here what you're doing is you're using the existing material and analysis of data that was originally collected by others. It's very unobtrusive, but it's detailed work looking at the other research. Sources for this could include data banks, books, magazines, newspaper, radio, television programs, personal documents, and internet sites. The term used to describe huge databases, which require high-end computing analysis, is known as big data. Triangulation uses several different research methods, data sources, and investigations, and or theoretical perspectives in the same study. Each method has its own strengths and weaknesses, so many sociologists believe that it's best to combine multiple methods in a given study. So we'll just touch now on some feminist research methods. Feminist social scientists have been critical of traditional sociological methodologies, and there's a good reason for such concern. Much of the research has limitations, including androcentricity, and check that in your textbook, and a more sexist language and concepts. Research methods that are biased in favor of men bring into question the research methodology. Research in which results that focus on members of one sex and are used to support conclusions about both sexes. The way in which feminists use research methods is different. It is women-centered. The goals are to help women improve their situations and to give voice to women. The researcher is seen as central to the research process rather than as an objective observer. So that's important to note. Critical research strategies, well, that's a little different. Critical research strategies dispute the neutrality of the scientific approach. Some researchers feel that this neutral stance implicates the researchers in the dominant power structure that creates and maintains injustices. Critical research strategies are rooted in a concern for social justice. Now, oppositional. Now, researchers place themselves on the side of the marginalized or the critique structures that marginalize them. Radical, well, researchers try to get at the roots of dominance and explore the interconnections of, for example, capitalism. And then subversive, well, here the researchers question the assumption in order to open the door to alternative understandings of the social world. So it's a far more complex process in this research. However, with all research, there are ethical issues. There's been a long history of the development of guidelines to protect the integrity, privacy, and honor the people being studied. Sociologists must follow a number of basic ethical standards. Participants must be voluntary. You can't be forced into research. No harm can come to the participants. Respect the rights of confidentiality and anonymity. Now, you can check out the examples provided in your text for some studies that raise questions regarding privacy. The Humphreys research, Magnotta and Ogden cases, and the issue of ethics and big data. I'd encourage you to review that just so you're familiar and how it might impact your own life. Okay, so this is the research part, and I really want to emphasize that this is what helps us in the study of sociology get a handle on what is social problems or issues and what is not, based on the research that's done. So when in this course we talk about the data that is gained from, say, Stats Canada and other such sites, it may not always feel to you that that data represents your experience or the experience of people that you know. And that's maybe true. But bear in mind that the research that's in the data that's found at Stats Canada is representative of real people in this country who experience these things. And so it's important to note that even if it doesn't affect you, it just means that where you are in society, these issues don't seem to manifest themselves. It's not unlike if you're lower income, some of this data is going to affect you. But if you're in a higher income family, then chances are some of the data, some of the things that affect lower income people, you won't even know about, and vice versa. So research is important to the science of sociology. And so the data that we talk about is research-based. I very rarely, if ever, will quote data that is not research-based. All right? So I hope this has been helpful. Good luck to you all. I hope it's moving along smoothly. We're just getting started. Next week, we're going to look at culture. Now, that will be divided into 2 videos, one in week 3 and one in week 4. All right, everybody. Bye now.